July 14, 1945, 6:10 a.m., as a pale gold sunrise broke across the rolling New Mexico desert and cast long trembling shadows over the strange metallic tower rising from the sands, America stood on the edge of a decision that would reshape the world more violently than any battle fought during the entire war. For on that morning, while winds swept across the Jornada del Muerto plain and scientists whispered nervously beside machines humming with barely contained power, the fate of Operation Downfall, the massive invasion plan to end the war with Japan, was already being reconsidered in secret rooms thousands of miles away, where military planners studied casualty estimates so catastrophic they defied comprehension, projections of a conflict that would swallow millions of lives if fought to its planned conclusion. Operation Downfall was to be the largest amphibious invasion in human history, dwarfing D-Day many times over, a monstrous two-stage assault code named Olympic and Coronet, beginning with a landing on Kyushu and followed by a strike at Honshu aimed directly at Tokyo, and American generals reviewing intelligence from intercepted Japanese communications knew with chilling certainty that the empire was preparing for a final suicidal defense unlike anything the world had ever seen. Caves were being fortified, civilians were training with bamboo spears, kamikaze pilots were volunteering faster than Japan could build aircraft, and thousands of hidden airfields carved into mountainsides promised waves of attacks that would turn the skies into burning chaos. Yet even these horrors paled compared to what Tokyo's leaders planned for the beaches, for the Japanese High Command had mobilized nearly every able-bodied man, woman, and teenager to defend the homeland, forming vast militias sworn to fight to the last drop of blood, a strategy they believed would force America into a negotiated peace rather than a total occupation. American intelligence warned that the invasion could cost between 1.7 and 4 million American casualties, including up to 800,000 dead, and more than 10 million Japanese lives, numbers so staggering that even hardened generals stared silently at the reports, knowing no democratic nation could endure losses on such a scale. But on that same morning, far from the Pacific, deep in the American desert, a different solution was about to reveal itself in a blinding flash of light so powerful that it would burn its memory into the eyes of every witness who stood there. As the clock ticked down toward the Trinity test, physicists like Oppenheimer and Fermi exchanged tense glances, their faces pale, their hands trembling not from fear of the explosion itself, but from fear of what the explosion would unleash, fear that this breakthrough would not merely end a war, but fundamentally alter human history, creating a weapon so terrible that nations might tremble at its very mention for generations to come. Soldiers stationed miles from Ground Zero crouched in trenches with their backs turned, goggles pressed tight to their faces, knowing that this was no ordinary test of military might, but the dawn of an age defined by fire hotter than the sun. When the device ignited at exactly 5:29 and 45 seconds a.m., the desert erupted into a white inferno brighter than daylight, brighter than anything the human eye was meant to witness, and for a heartbeat the entire world seemed to vanish in a blinding flash as if creation itself were being rewritten. A pillar of fire roared upward, twisting and billowing into the now iconic mushroom cloud, and the shock wave that followed tore across the desert like the wrath of a god awakening. Scientists who had dedicated years to theoretical equations fell silent, struck not by triumph but by dread. Oppenheimer whispered the ancient words from the Bhagavad Gita, "Now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds," and those who heard him felt a chill run through their bones because they knew, as he did, that what had just happened was more than a scientific achievement. It was a doorway opening into a future where war might never be fought the same way again. At that exact moment, across the Pacific, American planners at Pearl Harbor examined new reports from Okinawa, where the cost of victory had been catastrophic. Nearly 12,000 Americans killed and more than 100,000 Japanese dead, including thousands of civilians driven into madness by propaganda that promised Americans would slaughter them mercilessly. The ferocity of Okinawa terrified U.S. leaders because it represented a preview of what an invasion of the Japanese mainland would look like. Japanese soldiers fought to the last man. Civilians leapt off cliffs. Kamikaze aircraft struck American ships in waves, sinking destroyers and crippling carriers. If this happened on a small island far from Japan's sacred homeland, what unthinkable horrors would unfold when America landed on the beaches of Kyushu? The question haunted President Truman, who had taken office only months earlier after Roosevelt's sudden death, inheriting a global war at its final and most dangerous phase. Truman knew the stakes. He knew the numbers. He knew that every day the war continued meant thousands more deaths across Asia, POWs dying in captivity, civilians starving under occupation, cities burning under relentless bombing. And now, with the Trinity test proving the unimaginable, Truman held a decision so heavy it seemed almost beyond human authority. Use the atomic bomb and end the war instantly, or commit millions to an invasion that might destroy entire generations. Meanwhile, Japan's leadership, fractured by internal divisions, refused to consider surrender. The military demanded a final battle, insisting that American casualties would be so unbearable that the United States would negotiate peace on terms favorable to Japan. They prepared for Ketsugo, the decisive defense, positioning thousands of aircraft for kamikaze operations, building miles of trenches, stockpiling explosives for suicide charges, and organizing civilian brigades to attack invaders with grenades, spears, and homemade weapons. Japanese factories, though devastated, still produced enough war material to fuel months of brutal fighting. Every day Japan waited increased the eventual blood price. And yet the atomic bomb, this new force of nature, promised something neither side had fully imagined: an end to the war without an invasion, without years more bloodshed, without letting Japan fight to extinction. But no one knew whether the Japanese leadership would surrender even after witnessing such destructive power. They had not yielded to firebombing raids that burned Tokyo into ashes. They had not yielded after losing their fleet at Midway or their armies in Burma and the Philippines. They had not yielded after losing Okinawa. Would an atomic weapon, something the world had never seen, break their will at last? Or would it push them deeper into fanatic resistance? These questions swirled through Truman's mind as he prepared to leave for Potsdam, where he would meet Churchill and Stalin to discuss the final phase of the war. On the voyage, Truman received the coded message confirming the success of the Trinity test. "The baby is born." He read it twice, his hands steady, his expression unreadable, knowing that with those words the future had shifted. Operation Downfall, the largest invasion ever planned, now had a rival, an option as terrifying as it was decisive. But Truman was not yet ready to choose. He needed clarity about Japan's intentions, about the strength of Soviet cooperation, about the risks of using such a weapon. And so, even as the bomb's glare still echoed across the desert, the fate of millions remained suspended in uncertainty. But one truth had already begun to crystallize: the war would not end through conventional means. The world had stepped into a new era, and the decision waiting ahead would determine not only how the war ended, but how the next century would begin. Before we continue, please let me know: did anyone in your family fight in or live through World War II? Share their stories in the comments. Let's continue the story. July 16, 1945, early in the morning, as the first faint line of silver light crept across the desert horizon of New Mexico, the world unknowingly stood on the edge of an age it was not prepared to enter, and at 5:29 a.m., deep within the barren expanse of the Jornada del Muerto Valley, a team of scientists, soldiers, and military observers watched with taut, silent anticipation as the first atomic device in human history, codenamed the Gadget, waited atop its steel tower, suspended in the cool, breathless air, humming with the potential to end wars or, just as easily, end civilizations. And while none of them could fully articulate the weight of the moment, they all sensed that whatever happened in the next few seconds would echo across continents and generations, shaping destinies far beyond their desert test site. As countdown calls crackled through radios and tensions settled over the spectators like a tightening vice, General Leslie Groves stood with his arms folded, staring hard at the distant tower, knowing that this test was more than a scientific experiment. It was the fulcrum upon which the end of World War II might pivot, the element that could eliminate the need for Operation Downfall, the U.S. invasion of Japan that planners estimated would cost more than 1 million American lives and far more Japanese. And Groves understood that success here might change not only the war but the balance of global power itself. Nearby, J. Robert Oppenheimer exhaled shakily. His thin frame outlined against the strengthening dawn, his mind racing with equations, moral questions, and the haunting words he had read long ago in an ancient text, words he did not yet know he would one day speak aloud to define this moment in history. Yet his eyes remained locked on the horizon, waiting for the fire that he himself had helped to create. The fire that might save lives by preventing a catastrophic invasion, but would also unleash devastation unlike anything the world had ever witnessed. And as the final seconds ticked away, a stillness fell over the valley, a silence so complete that even the desert wind seemed to hold its breath. Then, in an instant, faster than thought, brighter than the sun, the world exploded into blinding light as the Trinity device ignited, sending a sphere of incandescent fire surging upward, boiling outward with the fury of a new star being born, illuminating the desert floor in stark, ghostly white as shock waves rippled across the valley, rattling equipment, shaking observation bunkers, and washing over the stunned observers, who shielded their eyes even from behind thick protective goggles. And in that overwhelming brilliance, in that core of impossible energy and roaring power, the future of Operation Downfall unraveled. Because in that moment the United States possessed a weapon capable of ending the war without launching the largest amphibious assault in human history. As the fireball rose into a towering column of mushroom-shaped flame, its base churning with violet, orange, and pulsating red hues, Oppenheimer murmured under his breath words later etched into the collective memory of humanity. Though faint, they captured the contradiction of triumph and dread that now defined the atomic age. And the officers and scientists around him exchanged stunned, wide-eyed looks, unable to reconcile the beauty and terror of the spectacle unfolding before them, yet fully aware that the course of World War II had just shifted. Irrevocably, from thousands of miles away in the Pacific, the planners of Operation Downfall were still preparing for what they believed would be the bloodiest battle of the war, training troops, mapping beaches, and analyzing Japan's defenses, unaware that on this morning in July, events in a remote American desert were dismantling the need for their colossal invasion plans, because the Trinity explosion meant that the United States could now bypass the nightmare scenarios of storming Kyushus, fortified coastlines or battling Japanese defenders in the mountainous terrain of Honshu, where nearly every civilian had been trained or ordered to resist to the death. Meanwhile, in Tokyo, far removed from the silent desert dawn, Japan's war cabinet clung stubbornly to hope, believing that inflicting heavy casualties on any U.S. invasion force would force a negotiated peace, unaware that the weapon tested this morning would render such strategies obsolete, because if the United States could unleash a single bomb capable of vaporizing entire districts, resistance would no longer buy time, only devastation. As the shock wave from Trinity expanded outward, trembling across the desert floor like the footsteps of an approaching giant, the United States military understood that the unimaginable had become real, and Groves exchanged a grave nod with Oppenheimer, signaling not celebration but recognition of responsibility, for this explosion would not simply end a war, it would begin a new and morally devastating chapter in human warfare. Yet the urgency of saving lives on both sides gave their mission grim clarity. If this weapon prevented Operation Downfall, then perhaps the horror here would spare millions. By mid-morning, reports and photographs of the explosion were already being secured under tight secrecy, guarded with absolute precision, because the next steps required flawless coordination. President Truman needed confirmation, the military needed delivery plans, and the scientists needed assurance that the weapon could be replicated, transported, and detonated over a target thousands of miles away in Japan. And even as the scorched tower in New Mexico collapsed into mangled steel, its purpose fulfilled, technicians swarmed the blast site, measuring radiation, collecting samples, and documenting crater dimensions, their movements swift and urgent, knowing they were now part of a race to end the war before Operation Downfall ever launched. At the same time, U.S. intelligence intercepted messages indicating that Japan was strengthening coastal defenses with suicidal fervor, training civilians, preparing underground bunkers, and positioning kamikaze units for a final, catastrophic stand, and every analyst who read these reports felt the same chill. The invasion would be a bloodbath, and the atomic bomb, now proven viable, had become not only a weapon of destruction but a potential shield against unimaginable loss. As the Trinity fireball dissipated into a towering, swirling cloud of ash and radioactive dust, drifting upward into the newly brightened sky. The men who witnessed it understood that history had pivoted in a single burst of light, that the desert had seen the birth of a force capable of ending empires and shaking the foundations of human morality, and that somewhere, far across the Pacific, Japan's leaders had no idea that their fate had already been sealed by a decision born in secrecy, carried forward by scientific brilliance, and ignited in a remote valley where the world stepped out of one age and into another. And as the sun continued to rise over the scorched earth of New Mexico, the United States prepared for the next step, taking this terrible new power to the heart of the war that had consumed the globe, ending not through invasion, but through a weapon no nation could have imagined before this morning's blinding flash. And as the shock of Trinity rippled outward across scientific, military, and political circles in the United States, the implications of the explosion began to crystallize into a single, staggering realization. The war could now be ended not through the tide of men, machines, and blood that had defined every major campaign so far, but through a weapon whose very existence rewrote strategic doctrine, compelling leaders from Washington to Tokyo to confront realities no previous generation had faced. For even as the desert cooled and the mushroom cloud drifted away into the upper atmosphere, President Truman, attending the Potsdam Conference in Germany, received coded word that the test had succeeded. And though the message was deliberately understated to maintain secrecy, those few clipped lines carried a weight that pressed upon every decision that followed, informing Truman that he now possessed an option beyond Operation Downfall, an option that might prevent the catastrophic loss of life projected by his military chiefs. Yet even as Washington celebrated the scientific success, no one ignored the sobering truth that each day Japan remained defiant, its defensive network strengthened, its military entrenched deeper into its homeland, preparing to resist the coming invasion with tactics that alarmed even the most hardened American commanders. For intercepted communications revealed that Japanese planners intended to convert every street, every hill, every rice field into a killing ground, and that civilian populations, including women and children, were being mobilized in desperate, tragic ways that promised an invasion unlike anything the modern world had ever seen. A scenario that haunted the minds of officers tasked with planning the landings at Kyushu and Honshu. Within the U.S. Strategic Bombing Survey, analysts pored over photographs of shattered Japanese cities, calculating the diminishing impact of conventional bombing and the increasing fanaticism of Japanese resistance, and these analysts, many of whom had never supported the idea of an atomic strike, found themselves grappling with the terrifying arithmetic of war. If a single bomb could end the conflict, even with its devastating consequences, it would prevent a scale of death that defied comprehension, a truth that became harder to ignore as intelligence painted a grim portrait of Japan's preparations for a final stand. Meanwhile, halfway across the Pacific, Admiral Nimitz and General MacArthur, two of the most influential military leaders in the theater, reviewed updated casualty estimates that now projected that American losses in Operation Downfall might exceed those suffered on D-Day many times over, compounded by kamikaze attacks, entrenched artillery, and the fierce determination of Japan's home defense forces, and both commanders, though differing in temperament and strategy, found themselves united in a quiet hope that the new weapon tested in New Mexico might provide a path to victory that did not drown both nations in blood. In Japan, however, the ruling elite remained locked in a tragic illusion, convinced that inflicting massive casualties on the United States during the initial invasion would force a negotiated peace, unaware that the war had moved beyond negotiations the moment the Trinity fireball lit the desert sky, and that even now, as Japanese leaders hardened their resolve, American ships were positioning themselves for the next phase of the conflict, delivery of a weapon so powerful that surrender would become the only rational choice. Yet the most haunting irony of this moment was that the Japanese public, exhausted by years of war, rationing, bombings, and grief, sensed the end approaching far more clearly than their military government did, and civilians in Tokyo, Osaka, Nagasaki, Kyoto, and countless smaller towns waited with quiet dread for whatever storm was gathering across the Pacific, never imagining that it would arrive, not as an army, nor as an armada, but as a sun-bright flash detonated thousands of feet above their cities. As the weeks after Trinity unfolded, the scientific teams at Los Alamos worked with relentless precision to assemble the next two devices, one uranium-based, the other plutonium-based, while military logistics officers coordinated the extraordinary effort required to transport, load, and deploy the bombs using specially modified B-29 superfortresses under the command of Colonel Paul Tibbets, whose calm demeanor belied the crushing responsibility he accepted without hesitation. At the same time, diplomats at Potsdam attempted one final effort to compel Japan to surrender through the issuance of the Potsdam Declaration, a stark warning that Japan would face prompt and utter destruction if it refused to lay down its arms, yet the declaration's language, intentionally vague to preserve nuclear secrecy, failed to convey the unimaginable reality behind those words, and Japan's leadership dismissed it as political theater, unaware that rejecting it had sealed their fate. Back in the United States, Truman, deeply troubled by the moral weight of nuclear warfare, wrestled with the burden of deciding to unleash the bomb, yet he could not ignore the grim projections handed to him, projections of American dead, wounded, and missing that soared into the hundreds of thousands if Operation Downfall proceeded, alongside civilian casualties in Japan that would eclipse even the most devastating battles of the war, and Truman understood that history would judge him not only for the decision he made, but for the lives saved or lost because of it, compelling him toward a choice that felt both necessary and unbearable. Thus, as July turned to August and the Pacific simmered under the heat of late summer, preparations entered their final, irreversible phase, and the weapon born in the desert, tested beneath the rising sun of New Mexico, moved closer to the moment it would be used not against sand and steel towers, but against living cities filled with people who had no idea that the world was about to change forever. And while military crews practiced their bombing runs, checked their instruments, and studied weather reports, the scientists who had built the bomb watched with a mixture of awe and dread, knowing they were witnessing the culmination of years of work that had begun with the fear that Nazi Germany might build such a weapon first, but now ended in a question none of them could answer. Could humanity survive the very power they had unleashed? Yet even as doubt flickered through their minds, events moved with the unstoppable momentum of history, because the decision had been made. The bomb would be used, Operation Downfall would not, and all that remained was for the world to witness the dawn that would rise not from the desert, but from the sky above a nation that still believed it could fight on, unaware that within days, everything would change in a flash of light brighter than the sun. And as August 1945 drew near, the Pacific seemed to hold its breath beneath a haze of heat and drifting clouds, for somewhere across the vast ocean, beyond the swells that carried convoys and the contrails carved by B-29s, an entire world was teetering on the edge of an ending it could neither see nor understand, while on board Tinian Island, the most important and least known airbase of the war, ground crews worked tirelessly under the blistering sun, installing final arming components, calibrating bomb racks, inspecting engines, and preparing the aircraft that would carry the most consequential payload in human history. Around them, tension simmered like electricity in the air, for although these men were hardened by years of war, used to launching raids that reduced entire cities to ruins, they knew instinctively that this mission was different, that history itself was leaning over their shoulders, watching in silence as wrenches turned and tools clattered softly against steel, each motion contributing to the final assembly of a weapon whose name, Little Boy, belied the unimaginable force it contained. At night, the island hummed with subdued conversations, anxious laughter, and the quiet scratching of pencils across letters home. Yet beneath this veneer of routine pulsed the awareness that the fate of millions now rested upon decisions made in cramped briefing rooms filled with cigarette smoke and maps pinned with red circles marking Hiroshima and Kokura as the primary targets, cities selected not only for military significance but also for the clarity of demonstrating the bomb's destructive capacity without interference from previous raids. Meanwhile, in Tokyo, the Japanese imperial cabinet spiraled deeper into paralysis, torn between war factions who insisted that honor demanded continued resistance, even at the cost of national annihilation, and peace-seeking ministers who understood that Japan stood on the edge of irreversible collapse. And daily, as American bombers flew overhead with near impunity, this internal struggle intensified, with meetings stretching long into the night as cities burned, railroads collapsed, and supply chains crumbled under relentless pressure. Some officials hoped desperately that the USSR might mediate peace, unaware that Soviet leaders had already committed to entering the war against Japan. A decision that would strike at the final illusion sustaining Japanese resistance, that negotiation was still possible. As diplomats argued, civilians endured another summer marked by hunger, exhaustion, and fear, their nights illuminated not by lanterns but by the glow of distant fires as yet another round of incendiary raids swept across the islands, leaving entire districts flattened and generations of memory reduced to ash. And still, many clung to the belief that Japan could negotiate terms that preserved some measure of sovereignty, utterly unaware that Washington now demanded unconditional surrender. Knowing full well that only total capitulation could prevent future conflict, back on Tinian, Colonel Paul Tibbets, chosen for the mission because of his unwavering discipline and calm under pressure, studied every detail of the flight plan, committing altitudes, headings, and timing to memory, while his crew on the Enola Gay ran drills until every movement became instinct, for any hesitation, any malfunction, any deviation could doom the mission and leave the bomb lost at sea or detonated. Accidentally, a risk so severe that even the thought of it tightened every man's chest. In Los Alamos and Washington, the scientists and strategists who had shaped this moment waited with a mix of dread and anticipation, knowing that within days, their theoretical calculations would manifest not in the desert but in a living city, where the blast wave would move through streets, bridges, and human bodies with indifferent force. And yet these same thinkers also understood that failure to use the bomb would condemn millions more to die in a conventional invasion, an outcome that felt not only inevitable but imminent if no alternative path was taken. On the evening before the mission, as darkness settled over Tinian and the ocean lapped softly against the island's coral shoreline, Tibbets walked alone for a brief moment, listening to the distant rumble of generators and the muted voices of sentries, feeling the immensity of what lay ahead press upon him like a physical weight. Yet he forced himself to maintain the resolve that had defined his career, knowing that doubt could not alter the necessity of the mission, nor the fact that by dawn he would be carrying a weapon unlike anything mankind had ever unleashed. The bomb itself, resting inside a heavily guarded hangar, seemed almost serene in its simplicity, an elongated steel casing, wires coiled with exquisite precision, uranium components arranged with scientific elegance. Yet those who approached it felt an unspoken reverence, as though standing in the presence of something that transcended war, something that belonged not to soldiers or nations, but to the very forces that govern the universe. Throughout the night, technicians armed the bomb under the glow of flashlights and low-hanging lamps, their hands steady but their minds racing with the knowledge that one misaligned wire or mistimed procedure could trigger catastrophe. And when the final safety pins were inserted and the last checks completed, the hangar fell into a heavy silence, broken only by the soft clatter of tools being set aside as men stepped back and stared at the object that would alter the course of history. Shortly before 3 a.m. on August 6, 1945, the Enola Gay rolled toward the runway, its engines thundering against the humid night air, and inside the cockpit, Tibbets exchanged a brief, sober glance with his crew, the kind of look shared by men who understood that they were about to cross a threshold from which the world could never return, while on the other side of the Pacific, Hiroshima slept beneath a soft pre-dawn mist, its trams quiet, its factory whistles silent, its schoolchildren dreaming unaware that their city, spared from previous bombing for reasons they could not comprehend, had been chosen not for mercy but for demonstration. And as the Enola Gay lifted into the sky, climbing steadily toward its rendezvous with destiny, no one aboard could know how the world would react when the sun rose on the first nuclear dawn, nor could they foresee the decades of consequences, political, moral, scientific, that would follow, for in that moment they thought only of the mission, the coordinates, the timing, and the solemn hope that this singular act of destruction might end a war that had already consumed tens of millions of lives across continents and oceans. And so the aircraft continued its ascent, engines roaring steadily as the Pacific faded beneath it, carrying with it the weapon that would end Operation Downfall before it began, and in doing so, change not only the end of the war, but the future of the world itself. And as the Enola Gay crossed the midpoint of the Pacific sky, flying above vast stretches of cloud-draped water that shimmered in the first hints of dawn, its crew settled into a tense, disciplined silence, each man focused on his assigned duty, while the weight of the mission pressed upon them more heavily than the aircraft's steel hull. For now, with Little Boy armed and secured, every mile brought them closer to the point from which there would be no turning back, Behind them, in the trailing distance of the open sky, two additional aircraft, the great artiste and necessary evil, followed at staggered intervals, carrying the scientific instruments and cameras needed to record the bomb's effects, their presence a solemn reminder that the mission was not merely military but experimental, and that the world, through their data and images, would soon come to understand a new kind of power, a power born not of gunpowder or steel but of atoms split with terrifying precision. As the horizon brightened, casting long ribbons of gold across the Pacific, Tibbets and his navigator, Major Dutch Van Kirk, reviewed their charts and headings, comparing the faint glint of landforms miles below to the carefully plotted route that would deliver them to Hiroshima at exactly the planned moment, for timing was everything, not only for accuracy, but to ensure that the observation planes could capture the event, and that the bomb would detonate at the precise altitude required to maximize its force without wasting its destructive potential in the wrong layer of atmosphere. Meanwhile, in Hiroshima itself, the morning unfolded with deceptive normalcy. Street vendors began setting up their stalls near the central market, mothers prepared breakfast over small charcoal stoves, factory workers gathered their belongings for the morning shift, and schoolchildren adjusted their satchels as they prepared to walk through the quiet streets, unaware that their city's clear skies, so rare after weeks of overcast weather, were the exact condition the Americans needed to greenlight Hiroshima as the primary target. At 7:30 a.m., Japanese spotters reported a small formation of American aircraft approaching from the south, but because the planes were few in number and flying at high altitude, the air raid sirens did not sound, for such flights were often reconnaissance missions, and civilians, accustomed to massive waves of bombers, paid little attention to lone silhouettes gliding through the distant sky. The Enola Gay, now descending to mission altitude, cut through the soft layers of morning cloud until the city came into view, a quiet grid of streets, factories, wooden homes, and the iconic dome of the Industrial Promotion Hall, all bathed in a serene, deceptive calm that gave no hint of the devastation moments away. Inside the bomb bay, the climate-controlled cavity housing Little Boy thrummed faintly as internal components stabilized for release, and physicist William Parsons, who had armed the bomb mid-flight, double-checked the circuits with the cold discipline of a man who understood that a single misconnection could doom the mission and possibly the aircraft itself. Tibbets ordered the bomb run initiated, and the crew shifted into final procedure, their movements crisp, practiced, automatic, though beneath their professionalism lay a storm of unspoken thoughts, questions of morality, necessity, and the unknown consequences waiting just beyond the horizon of their imaginations. For none of them had seen a nuclear weapon detonated near a city. None had witnessed what an atomic blast did to streets, homes, and human bodies, and though they knew intellectually the destructive capacity of Little Boy, the reality of what they were about to unleash lingered in their minds with a stillness more powerful than fear. At precisely 8:15 a.m., Tibbets steadied the aircraft over the aiming point, a T-shaped bridge that stood out clearly among the rooftops below, and Bombardier Thomas Farabee, calm as ever, released the bomb with the practiced precision of countless drills, watching as Little Boy fell silently away, beginning its 43-second descent toward the city, a moment so quiet, so deceptively gentle, that even the crew felt the surreal pause as they veered sharply to avoid the coming shockwave. Below, the bomb plummeted past factory windows, telephone wires, and rooftops, unnoticed by the thousands of people beginning their morning routines, until at 600 meters above the city, Little Boy detonated in a burst of light brighter than the sun, a flash that overwhelmed the sky and shattered shadows, illuminating every corner of Hiroshima in an instant that defied description, a moment when time seemed to fracture into before and after. The blast wave erupted outward with a force of 15,000 tons of TNT, flattening buildings, igniting fires, shattering windows miles away, and creating a column of rising heat so intense it twisted steel and fused earth into glass. And although the Enola Gay had already banked sharply to escape the blast zone, the shock wave still slammed against the aircraft with such force that the crew felt the vibration reverberate through their bones, prompting a brief surge of fear that the plane might lose control. Yet Tibbet steadied it, gripping the controls with calm authority as the next tremor rolled over them. Behind them, the crew turned to look through the rear windows and saw what would later become one of the most iconic and haunting images in history. A towering mushroom cloud, growing, twisting, rising into the sky with an eerie elegance, its base obscured by the chaotic swirl of fire and pulverized debris, its stem glowing with heat, its pinnacle blooming like a monstrous flower fed by unimaginable energy. Though none aboard could yet comprehend the scale of destruction below, the silence inside the plane deepened. Each man left alone with his thoughts as they turned away from the rising cloud and continued on their escape route, aware that the world beneath them had changed forever in the span of a single blinding moment. Miles below, Japanese officials stared in stunned confusion as communication lines snapped, radio stations went silent, and reports began trickling in from the outskirts describing a flash, a roar, a wave of heat unlike anything anyone had experienced. At first, no one could grasp what had occurred. Some believed the city had been struck by a massive chemical explosion, others that it had been hit by an unknown superweapon. But as reconnaissance planes flew over the smoking ruins hours later, the scale of destruction became impossible to deny. Hiroshima no longer resembled a city, but a scar carved into the earth, a flattened landscape dotted with pillars of flame, the skeletal frames of buildings standing like ghostly monuments to a moment that defied comprehension. And even then, the Japanese leadership, trapped between disbelief and fear, did not surrender. For while Hiroshima stunned them, it did not break the chain of command that insisted Japan must fight on, must endure, must preserve the honor of the empire even at the cost of annihilation. And thus the world took one step closer to the moment when a second bomb, and the entry of the Soviet Union into the war, would force the final decision no one could escape. And yet, even as the blackened cloud over Hiroshima continued to rise like a pillar marking the end of an age, the shock waves of the blast rippling not only through the ruined streets but through military intelligence centers, diplomatic offices, and war rooms across the Pacific, the Japanese High Command found itself paralyzed between disbelief and denial. For although Hiroshima's destruction had been confirmed through fragmented survivor communications and reconnaissance flights that returned with photographs of a city erased from existence, many in Tokyo struggled to comprehend the nature of the weapon that had caused such devastation. Some arguing that it must have been a new incendiary device, others clinging to the misguided belief that the Americans could not possibly possess more than one such bomb, and still others insisting that Japan must not surrender, regardless of the cost. For surrender meant not only military defeat, but the collapse of the imperial ideology that had shaped Japanese society for generations. Meanwhile, in the halls of the Supreme War Council, debates raged with increasing ferocity, voices rising, tempers fraying, some ministers urging for immediate negotiations to end the war while others argued that national honor demanded resistance to the last man. Yet even as these arguments clashed, time continued its relentless march, for the United States had no intention of allowing hesitation to alter the course of its plan, and in New Mexico, at Los Alamos, and in Washington, decisions were made with cold efficiency. If Japan did not surrender after Hiroshima, a second bomb would be deployed, and if that failed, the invasion, Operation Downfall, would proceed with catastrophic cost to both sides. On Tinian Island, as news of Hiroshima's destruction spread among the crews, a mixture of grim satisfaction and quiet dread filled the air, for though they understood that the mission had succeeded, they also knew that history had turned a corner from which no path led back to the world that existed before the blast. And many crew members, still dazed by the sight of the mushroom cloud and the knowledge of what they had unleashed, walked silently along the airstrip that evening, staring out at the horizon as if expecting it to reveal answers to the questions now haunting them. At 3:49 a.m. on August 9th, another B-29 boxcar lifted off from Tinian carrying Fat Man, a plutonium implosion-type bomb far more complex and powerful than Little Boy, and though Kokura was its intended target, heavy clouds and smoke from previous raids obscured the aiming point, forcing the crew to divert to their secondary target. Nagasaki, a city of steep hills, narrow valleys, and industrial sites that had played a significant role in Japan's war effort, yet whose residents awoke that morning like any other, unaware that fate had redirected catastrophe toward them. When the bomb detonated above Nagasaki at 11:02 a.m., the shock wave surged through the city's valleys with devastating force, igniting factories, flattening homes, and sending a column of boiling heat and ash into the sky. That mirrored the horrific beauty of Hiroshima's cloud, and though the city's geography spared it from the full symmetric annihilation seen days earlier, the destruction was nonetheless unimaginable, tearing through districts that moments before had been alive with workers, families, and children preparing for school. Within hours, Japanese officials received word of the second attack, and the weight of realization began to crush even the most hardened militarists. The United States possessed not one bomb but multiple, and if Japan continued to resist, more cities would vanish, one after another, until nothing remained but ashes scattered across the archipelago. Yet even as this truth dawned, the War Council remained deadlocked, unable to reach the unanimous decision required for surrender, trapped between factions that refused to accept defeat, and those who understood that further resistance would lead not to glory but extinction. In the midst of this internal paralysis, another blow struck Japan with seismic force. The Soviet Union, honoring its secret agreement with the United States and Britain, declared war on Japan on August 8, launching a massive invasion of Manchuria that shattered the Guangdong Army, once considered the pride of the Japanese military. The speed and scale of the Soviet advance revealed to Japanese leaders that even if they could somehow endure American bombings, they could not survive a two-front war against the world's largest army and the world's most advanced industrial power, and suddenly, the illusion that Japan could negotiate favorable terms crumbled completely, for the nation that many in the Japanese government had hoped would mediate peace had instead entered the conflict to claim its share of the spoils, leaving Japan isolated, encircled, and without allies. Emperor Hirohito, long shielded from the most brutal realities of the war, received detailed briefings on Hiroshima, Nagasaki, and the Soviet invasion, and the weight of responsibility settled upon him with crushing clarity, for he understood that the continuation of the war would bring not only the annihilation of the military but the complete destruction of Japan itself, and so, breaking centuries of imperial detachment, he stepped forward to exert his authority, urging the government to accept the terms of the Potsdam Declaration, even if it meant surrender, even if it meant ending the war not with victory but with survival. Still, resistance persisted among military hardliners who believed that a final decisive battle on the Japanese mainland, one that would cost millions of lives, might force the Allies to negotiate a compromise. Yet this belief was no longer grounded in strategy, but in a desperate refusal to accept reality, and as they clung to their illusions, the world around them continued to collapse, with American reconnaissance flights circling the ruins of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, preparing for further strikes if necessary, and Soviet forces sweeping through Japanese-held territory with unstoppable momentum. As the hours passed, the divide within Japan's leadership grew more dangerous, with fears spreading that the military might attempt a coup to prevent surrender, and indeed, whispers circulated through Tokyo of officers gathering in secret, discussing whether they should seize the imperial palace, destroy the emperor's recorded surrender speech, and force the war to continue. Yet even as these shadows moved through the night, Hirohito remained resolute, determined to break the deadlock and save his nation from annihilation. And so, in the early hours of August 15th, the emperor's decision was broadcast across Japan in a crackling, faint recording, the first time his subjects had ever heard his voice, announcing that the war had reached a situation no longer favorable and that Japan must endure the unendurable, must accept surrender to preserve what remained of the nation, a message that fell over the country like a storm of conflicting emotions, unleashing grief, relief, disbelief, and despair all at once, yet bringing with it the final truth that the war which had consumed the world for 6 relentless years had at last come to an end. And as Emperor Hirohito's voice faded from the radios of millions of stunned listeners across Japan, his carefully chosen words drifting through shattered cities, scorched farmlands, and quiet coastal villages still haunted by the echoes of air raid sirens, a profound, almost unreal stillness settled across the nation, a silence unlike anything felt since the war began, for it was not the silence of fear or anticipation, but the silence of a world forced to acknowledge that everything had changed in a single moment. Soldiers on remote island garrisons wept openly or stared blankly at the horizon, unable to reconcile their years of sacrifice with the sudden command to lay down arms, while civilians huddled around their radios in disbelief, struggling to interpret the archaic, formal language of the imperial broadcast until its meaning became unmistakable. Japan had surrendered. The war was over, and even as relief washed over some, sorrow tore through others, for surrender meant not only defeat, but the collapse of an identity shaped for generations by ideals of honor, duty, and loyalty to an emperor believed to be divine, and now, with a single announcement, the divine figure had chosen the path of survival over destruction, shattering the illusions of those who believed death preferable to capitulation. In the hours that followed, American and Allied leaders received Japan's official declaration, and from Washington to London to Moscow, the world exhaled, though beneath the relief lay a lingering unease, for the atomic bomb had revealed a future filled not with peace but with questions, with fears, with possibilities so vast and terrible that even the victors could not fully comprehend what they had unleashed. Aboard the Missouri in Tokyo Bay, plans began forming for the formal signing of surrender, a ceremony designed not merely to end the war but to establish a new world order shaped by the knowledge that nuclear weapons now existed, and that any future conflict could lead not to the destruction of armies but the destruction of humanity itself. Across the Pacific, on islands where American troops waited for the invasion that would never come, cheers erupted as news of surrender spread through the ranks, tears streaking the dust-covered faces of Marines who had fought from Guadalcanal to Okinawa, knowing firsthand the price of every mile gained against an enemy whose determination seemed limitless. Yet now, for the first time in years, they allowed themselves to imagine going home, stepping off the battlefield and returning to lives that felt impossibly distant. On Tinian, the crews of the Enola Gay and Boxcar quietly absorbed the news, each man coping in his own way. Some relieved that their missions had ended the war, others troubled by the scale of destruction they had helped unleash, and still others fearing that future generations might condemn them for actions taken in the chaos of global conflict. Meanwhile, in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, where survivors staggered through landscapes that looked like visions from a nightmare carved into the earth, the concept of surrender felt almost abstract, overshadowed by the overwhelming tasks of searching for loved ones, tending to the wounded, and confronting the incomprehensible truth that their cities had been erased in mere seconds, replaced by fields of ash, twisted steel, and the haunting silence of lives that had vanished. As relief efforts struggled to reach the devastated areas, American reconnaissance planes flew overhead, capturing images that would later horrify the world. Images of shadows burned into stone, of bodies vaporized, of buildings reduced to skeletal remains standing amid oceans of rubble. And these photographs, when shown to political leaders, scientists, and civilians, forced them to confront the reality that nuclear weapons were not simply powerful but apocalyptic, capable of transforming the fabric of life itself in ways that no conventional weapon ever could. In Tokyo, as occupation forces prepared to take control of the city, the remnants of a fractured government moved to dismantle the military structure that had led Japan into the war, issuing orders for troops across Asia and the Pacific to surrender peacefully, though many units, isolated or indoctrinated beyond reason, resisted the orders or took their own lives rather than accept defeat, demonstrating how deeply the ideology of eternal resistance had taken root in the hearts of some. Yet despite pockets of continued defiance, Japan's surrender marked not only the end of World War II but the beginning of a reconstruction effort unlike anything seen before, one that would transform the nation from a ravaged empire into a modern democratic state, guided by American occupation. Forces who sought to reshape its political, economic, and social foundations, believing that only profound reform could prevent future conflict. While this transformation unfolded, scientists who had worked on the Manhattan Project began to grapple with the moral implications of their achievement, torn between pride in ending the war and horror at the weapon's destructive capacity. And as they debated publicly and privately about the future of the atomic age, their voices helped spark international discussions that would, in time, lead to attempts at nuclear regulation, arms control, and a recognition that the fate of humanity now depended not merely on diplomacy but on the careful management of a technology capable of ending civilization. Meanwhile, in the ruins of Hiroshima, a strange quiet strength began to emerge among survivors, who, despite unimaginable loss, started rebuilding with a resilience that astonished even foreign observers, constructing makeshift shelters, tending to the injured, and slowly restoring life amid devastation, a testament to the human capacity to endure and rebuild even in the aftermath of catastrophe. As months passed and the world transitioned from war to uneasy peace, the memory of Operation Downfall, the invasion that never happened, faded into historical speculation, overshadowed by the stark reality that nuclear weapons had rendered such invasions obsolete. for no nation could ever again risk fighting a war that might provoke atomic retaliation. Yet the hidden operation remained significant, for its planning illuminated the true stakes of the war's final chapter. The millions who would have died, the cities that would have burned, the soldiers who would never have returned home, the civilians who would have been caught in a struggle of unimaginable scale, and in this sense, the bombs, horrific as they were, prevented a catastrophe even greater, ending the war before downfall could begin, sparing lives even as they claimed them, creating a paradox that historians would debate for decades. And as the final embers of conflict faded into the horizon of history, the world stepped into a new era defined not by the armies that had fought across continents, but by the knowledge of what humanity had proven itself capable of unleashing. For with the end of World War II came the beginning of the nuclear age, a time when peace could no longer be taken for granted, but had to be preserved with vigilance, diplomacy, and an understanding that the mistakes of the past could never be repeated if civilization was to survive the shadows cast by the mushroom clouds over Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And for the first time, Japan sensed that fate had already turned against them. Yet even as that realization rippled quietly through the corridors of military command, the nation clung to a defiant resolve, refusing to believe that a power as vast and industrially awakened as the United States could continue accelerating beyond anything Japan's strategists had imagined. For while Tokyo had envisioned a long, grinding war of attrition in which America's morale would fracture before Japan's resources ran dry, the reality unfolding by late 1944 revealed a completely different war, one guided not merely by soldiers and sailors but by logistics, mathematics, and cold, unrelenting production capacity that transformed the Pacific into a stage where Japan's once daring strategies now appeared hopelessly outdated. And as the weeks pressed on, the Allied command continued refining Operation Downfall, even though new intelligence, intercepted communications, and on-the-ground reconnaissance painted a picture so dire that planners secretly agreed the invasion would likely become the bloodiest military operation in human history, with casualty projections rising so steeply that even hardened strategists began to pale at the numbers scrawled across briefing maps, for they saw beaches lined with bunkers, mountains fortified into natural citadels, and entire civilian populations prepared to fight with bamboo spears if necessary. Yet despite the looming horror, preparations continued because the war machine demanded momentum. Ships were being assembled, divisions redeployed, and training intensified across the Pacific Islands where American troops rehearsed amphibious assaults against mock Japanese fortifications built to mirror the defensive networks of Kyushu. Meanwhile, Japan, equally aware of the coming storm, poured what remained of its strength into defensive preparations, transforming schoolyards into firing pits, coastal plains into kill zones, and entire villages into labyrinths of trenches where elderly men and teenage boys drilled with wooden rifles, creating the grim expectation that when the invasion finally came, it would not be fought merely by armies but by entire populations, turning Japan's homeland into a battlefield of unimaginable scale, a reality that weighed heavily on American planners who convened nightly under dim lights, poring over aerial photographs and typed reports from B-29 reconnaissance crews returning from high-altitude surveys of Japan's coastline, and as these reports stacked higher, revealing deeper and deeper layers of Japanese resistance, the United States quietly accelerated its evaluation of an alternative solution, one that had been whispered about only in the most restricted, top-secret circles, a weapon whose power existed beyond anything the world had known, a device born in the desert heat of New Mexico under a shroud of absolute secrecy, known to only a handful of men sworn to silence. And as Trinity's success sent shockwaves through the scientific and military elite, a new question emerged within the highest levels of command. Could this weapon end the war before downfall ever began, sparing millions of lives at the cost of an act so devastating that it would alter the course of human history? This question dominated the war rooms where generals gathered with somber expressions, each man aware that choosing not to invade would save American divisions from annihilation, but also unleash a destructive force upon cities teeming with civilians, a dilemma that weighed heavier with every intercepted Japanese communication, for these transmissions revealed that Tokyo had no intention of surrendering, even as its navy lay crippled, its air force shattered, and its cities burning from relentless B-29 raids, meaning that without an unforeseen turning point, the Pacific War would continue into late 1946 or even 1947, stretching human endurance and national resources to breaking points unimaginable at the war's outset. Thus, in the final days before the Potsdam Conference, the momentum of events accelerated with unsettling clarity, as President Truman received reports that Japan was fortifying Kyushu more heavily than predicted, shifting divisions from Manchuria and Korea, and transforming coastal towns into defensive strongholds that would ensure American forces landing on the beaches faced immediate fire from every hill, every cliff, every trench, intensifying the fear that downfall would mirror the worst horrors of Okinawa magnified 100-fold. For at Okinawa, tens of thousands of lives were lost in a single campaign, even without civilian resistance on the scale expected in Japan's homeland, and this comparison reverberated through strategic circles, forcing military planners to admit quietly, sometimes reluctantly, that even America's industrial might could not shield its troops from the cost of an invasion fought in the heart of a nation prepared to sacrifice everything. Meanwhile, Japanese leaders, though starving for hope, clung desperately to the belief that if the United States invaded, Japan could inflict such massive casualties that Washington would be forced into negotiating a ceasefire, a belief fueled by nationalist pride, military tradition, and decades of propaganda promising that the samurai spirit would outlast Western firepower. But this belief also blinded Tokyo to a terrifying truth. While Japan prepared for a last stand rooted in centuries-old warrior ethos, the United States was preparing to deploy a weapon born not from tradition but from the most advanced science on Earth, a weapon that rendered coastal guns, beach traps, and massed infantry irrelevant, a weapon capable of ending the war without a single American soldier stepping onto Japanese soil. And as late July approached, the tempo of intelligence briefings increased to a fevered pitch, with analysts presenting chilling evidence that the Japanese High Command remained firmly committed to total war, mobilizing civilians, expanding kamikaze strategies, and stockpiling supplies for a final defense that would drag on for months or even years, further strengthening the argument that downfall, though meticulously planned, might destroy Japan entirely before bringing peace, a reality that Truman and his advisers could not ignore, especially after reading Casualty. Estimates that predicted up to 1 million Allied troops and several million Japanese civilians might die in the invasion. At the same time, the Manhattan Project, having crossed the threshold from theory to reality, forced a new calculus into the war's equation, as scientists drafted final reports describing the detonation at Trinity, explaining the wave of heat, the blast pressure, the rising column of fire that turned the desert's sand into glass, and the strange silence that followed before. The world realized the dawn of a new era had arrived, and while many scientists recoiled from the weapon's power, believing it should never be used, others argued that its terrible force might be the only means of preventing millions of additional deaths on all sides, a debate that reached Truman's ears even as he prepared to confront Japan with a final ultimatum at Potsdam. Yet despite the ultimatum, despite the demonstrations of American air dominance, and despite the collapse of Japan's navy, Tokyo remained defiant, insisting on impossible surrender terms that Washington could never accept, revealing once more the depth of Japan's commitment to fight to the last man. And with each passing hour, Truman and his advisers saw the invasion of Japan becoming less a military operation and more a humanitarian catastrophe waiting to unfold, pushing them closer to a decision that would define not only the end of the war but the moral landscape of human civilization. And so, with Operation Downfall looming like a shadow over the Pacific, the United States moved quietly, deliberately, and with immense secrecy toward a single conclusion: that the war could not end through invasion, negotiation, or attrition. It could end only through a shock so profound that Japan's military command would finally comprehend the futility of resistance, a shock so overwhelming that even the most hardened generals would realize survival required surrender. And thus the stage was set not on the beaches of Kyushu but in the bomb bays of aircraft preparing for a mission unlike any the world had witnessed, a mission that would bring about the end of the war not through the clash of armies but through the force of a single decision echoing through history, a mission that would bring about the end of the war not through the clash of armies but through the force of a single decision echoing through history. And as American planners gathered in dimly lit command rooms to finalize the details of this unprecedented operation, the mood was neither triumphant nor eager, but heavy, solemn, shaped by the awareness that they were about to cross a boundary that could never be uncrossed. For the weapon they were preparing to deploy was not merely another bomb, but a force capable of reshaping the very nature of warfare, diplomacy, and human survival. Even the aircrews selected for the mission were briefed in strict secrecy, unaware of the exact nature of their payload, told only that their flight was of special strategic importance. While engineers loaded the bomb with methodical precision, each bolt tightened and wire connected under the watch of officers who seldom spoke, their eyes reflecting the weight of responsibility more than any excitement of victory. And across the Pacific, American forces continued rehearsing for Operation Downfall, even as new intelligence hinted it might never occur. Yet these troops trained with the grim understanding that if the weapon failed, faltered, or did not produce the shock necessary to force surrender, then they would still be tasked with storming the beaches of Kyushu, pushing inland through fire, trenches, and resistance unlike anything the Pacific War had yet produced. Simultaneously, in Tokyo, the Japanese High Command remained divided between factions, some desperate for peace, others determined to fight on, but all unaware that within days their world would change irrevocably. For while they clung to the belief that the United States would not risk the catastrophic losses of a homeland invasion, they had no inkling that America intended to bypass the invasion entirely, not with diplomacy, not with blockade, but with a single blow so unimaginable that it would collapse Japan's capacity to resist not through military defeat but psychological devastation. And as August approached, the Pacific region seemed to hold its breath, with American submarines tightening their patrol lines, B-29 crews flying reconnaissance missions with increasing frequency, and scientists, exhausted, haunted, yet resolute, sending their final calculations to Washington, confirming that the bomb was fully operational and ready for deployment, leaving only the question of where and when it would strike, a decision Truman agonized over, knowing that every city on the target list was filled, not only with factories and garrisons but with families, children, and civilians caught in the machinery of war. Yet Truman's choice grew clearer with every intercepted Japanese communication, with every report of kamikaze stockpiles, fortified ridges, and underground tunnel systems prepared to turn Kyushu into a graveyard for both sides. And so, while invasion plans remained on the table, the truth was that downfall had effectively begun transitioning from reality to contingency, overshadowed by a weapon the world had never imagined possible, a weapon now poised to determine the outcome of the war more decisively than any battle ever could. And when the order was finally given, it was delivered not with fanfare but with quiet resolve, the kind of resolve born from necessity rather than ambition, as aircrews prepared for a mission that would require flawless execution, precise timing, and absolute secrecy, lifting into the sky under cover of early morning light while officers on the ground watched in silence, aware that history was being written in the faint drone of engines disappearing into the horizon. And thus the final phase began, not Operation Downfall as originally envisioned, with landing craft crashing onto Japanese shores, but a different kind of downfall entirely, one delivered from the sky, carrying a force so immense it could end a war in seconds, altering the fate of nations and reshaping the world into an era defined not by expanding empires or global conquest but by the sobering realization that humanity had unlocked a power capable of destroying itself, a realization that would haunt the decades to come even as it brought the Second World War to its brutal, unthinkable conclusion. And as the faint echo of engines faded into the Pacific sky, the final hours before the world changed forever passed with an eerie quiet that seemed to blanket every command center, every war room, every coastal outpost in both hemispheres, for although neither nation yet understood the scale of what was coming, both could sense, somewhere deep beneath the routines of war, that the conflict had reached a threshold, a moment where decisions no longer shaped battles but shaped civilizations. And nowhere was this tension felt more sharply than aboard the B-29 flying steadily across the vast expanse of ocean, its crew maintaining disciplined silence as they monitored instruments glowing dimly in the pre-dawn cabin light, each man aware that their mission carried a weight unlike any raid before it, not because of the enemy defenses nor because of the flight distance, but because the weapon fixed in the bomb bay below them represented a transformation of warfare itself, a device that fused theory with fire, mathematics with destruction, and secrecy with unimaginable force. Meanwhile, far behind them in Washington, senior officials monitored coded transmissions with grave expressions, waiting for confirmation signals, aware that they had unleashed something irreversible, while in Japan, civilian life continued in uneasy normalcy, families collecting water, children gathering firewood, workers sweeping the streets, completely unaware that a bomber was approaching their skies carrying a weapon whose name they had never heard, whose power no nation had ever seen, and whose detonation would redefine the meaning of war. As the sun rose over the Japanese coastline, casting long shadows across rice fields and distant mountain ridges, air raid observers scanned the horizon with routine diligence, accustomed to the presence of American bombers but unaware that this particular aircraft flew higher than most raids, solitary and unescorted, a detail that some watchers found curious but not alarming, for the war had numbed Japan to the constant drone of B-29s. Yet high above them, in the cabin of the bomber, the final preparations unfolded with a sense of ritual precision, every step rehearsed, every instrument checked twice, the crew moving with calm, practiced motions even as their thoughts churned beneath the surface, not from fear of enemy fire or mechanical failure, but from the awareness that the world after this mission would not resemble the world before it, and as the target city came into view, its streets beginning to stir with the early morning pulse of daily life, the bombardier adjusted the crosshairs of his sighting device, aligning the silhouette of the urban sprawl below, breathing steadily as the aircraft drifted into position under the direction of the pilot and navigator, the bomb bay doors opening with a low mechanical groan like an exhalation from the depths of history, preparing to release something no human eye had ever witnessed. At the precise moment the weapon fell, slipping from the B-29's belly into the open air, no sound marked its departure beyond the soft metallic click of release, and yet, in that unremarkable instant, the trajectory of the war, indeed, the trajectory of human capability, shifted, for the downward arc of the bomb represented not merely a military action but a collision between scientific achievement and the harsh demands of global conflict, a collision that produced consequences neither side could fully comprehend. As the bomber banked sharply away, climbing to a safer altitude, the crew watched the city shrink beneath them, unaware of the exact timing, unaware of the flash that was about to engulf the landscape, until the horizon behind them suddenly ignited in an eruption of light so intense that men shielded their eyes instinctively, a light unlike the glow of firebombs, unlike the flare of artillery, a light that seemed to tear open the sky itself, and though they could not hear the blast from such distance, they felt its presence in the tremor that rippled through the air and in the rising column of smoke, fire, and dust that spiraled upward like a newborn storm, marking the moment the world entered the atomic age. Within minutes, commanders in Washington received the coded message confirming the weapon's detonation, and a deep silence filled the room, heavy with the knowledge that although the mission had succeeded, humanity had crossed a threshold from which there was no retreat, while in Tokyo, confusion spread rapidly through communication channels as fragmented reports described a blinding flash, a sudden burst of heat, and an explosion of unprecedented scale that left observers struggling to articulate what they had seen, unable to compare it to any prior attack. As military analysts attempted to decipher the magnitude of the destruction, the Japanese government hesitated, uncertain of whether this was a new type of incendiary, a chain reaction from fuel depots, or something far more devastating, and while they debated, the United States prepared a second strike, convinced that one blast, even one so overwhelming, might not be enough to force surrender from a nation whose doctrine insisted on resistance until the final breath. As diplomatic tensions escalated, and as intercepted communications revealed the continued unwillingness of Japan's hardline factions to consider unconditional surrender, the American command reached its final, grim conclusion. Another detonation was necessary, not out of vengeance or ambition, but because intelligence analysts feared that without a second shock, Japan's leadership would interpret the first blast as an anomaly rather than a definitive shift in the balance of power. And so, preparations began for the second mission, with air crews once again briefed under a veil of secrecy, their aircraft inspected meticulously, the weapon loaded with ritual precision, and the target chosen for maximum psychological impact, not just military value but the shattering of any remaining illusion that Japan could endure through sheer willpower. Meanwhile, across Japan's devastated cities, survivors wandered through streets coated in ash, dazed and silent, searching for water, shelter, or family members, the scale of destruction unlike anything they had ever imagined, and yet even amidst the devastation, many citizens still believed the war could continue, unaware of the scientific nature of the weapon or the impossibility of defending against such force. And this belief persisted until the second attack, when once again a bomber appeared, releasing another device that exploded in a sphere of light even more devastating in its implications, confirming to military leaders and civilians alike that Japan now faced an adversary wielding a weapon capable of annihilating entire cities in seconds. In the hours after the second blast, Japanese command centers buzzed with frantic debate, the hardline factions still insisting that an invasion could be repelled, pointing to stockpiled weapons, mobilized civilians, and the defensive depth of their homeland. But their voices grew weaker as more reports arrived, each one more harrowing than the last, describing not just destruction but the complete paralysis of urban infrastructure, communication networks, and emergency response systems, forcing even the most stubborn commanders to face a truth they had long denied. The war could no longer be fought by conventional means, nor could Japan hope to negotiate from a position of strength when faced with an enemy capable of leveling entire regions without deploying a single soldier. In Washington, Truman and his advisers monitored the unfolding situation with a mixture of relief and dread. Relief that the weapons had functioned as intended and might end the war swiftly, and dread over the enormity of what had been unleashed upon the world, knowing that the atomic bomb represented not only the end of one war but the beginning of a new era defined by the possibility of human self-destruction. And as Japan's leadership finally convened for an emergency meeting, the Emperor himself intervened for the first time, urging surrender to prevent further devastation, a moment that broke the political stalemate and began the process that would soon bring an official end to the most devastating conflict in human history. By the time Japan transmitted its intention to surrender, the world had shifted irreversibly, leaving behind the age of conventional warfare and stepping into a future shaped by the shadow of nuclear capability, a future in which nations would wage cold battles of ideology, science, and deterrence rather than massive ground invasions and Operation Downfall, the invasion that might have consumed millions, quietly dissolved into history as a contingency plan no longer required, replaced by a new understanding that wars could now end not through prolonged campaigns but through moments of instantaneous, world-altering devastation. Thus, as the full weight of the atomic age settled upon humanity, the world realized that the conclusion of the Pacific War, though decisive, carried consequences far deeper than victory or defeat, marking the dawn of a new chapter in which the power to end wars had become inseparable from the power to end civilizations. And as the full weight of the atomic age settled upon humanity, the world realized that the conclusion of the Pacific War, though decisive, carried consequences far deeper than victory or defeat, marking the dawn of a new chapter in which the power to end wars had become inseparable from the power to end civilizations. And yet even as news of Japan's willingness to surrender rippled through Allied command centers, the machinery of war continued moving, because nothing in a global conflict as vast as World War II ever stopped instantly. Ships still patrolled the Pacific, bombers still flew reconnaissance routes, and soldiers still held their positions on islands where they waited for official confirmation from headquarters, unsure whether the war was truly over or whether another battle awaited them. And in these tense hours, commanders on both sides navigated the dangerous space between active combat and approaching peace, a period where misunderstandings could ignite unnecessary tragedy, while diplomats prepared the formal language of surrender that would shape not only Japan's future but the geopolitical structure of the world for generations. In Tokyo, confusion mixed with disbelief as civilian and military officials attempted to interpret the emperor's unprecedented announcement. His voice broadcast across the nation in a tone that many citizens had never heard before, a voice not commanding attack or sacrifice but urging endurance, patience, and acceptance of an ending that carried both sorrow and relief. And as people gathered in silence throughout cities and villages, some wept, some bowed, and others simply stared into the distance, struggling to reconcile years of propaganda, hardship, and loyalty with the reality that Japan had finally reached a point where continuing the war would no longer preserve the nation but destroy it. Meanwhile, American forces advancing across the Pacific received the news with a complex mixture of emotions, relief most of all, but also disbelief and exhaustion, for many had prepared themselves for Operation Downfall with the grim expectation that they might not survive the invasion, and now that the threat of that massive assault was fading, they found themselves caught between gratitude and the quiet weight of knowing that the war had ended not because Japan had been defeated conventionally, but because humanity had entered a new era of destructive capability. As military leaders awaited the official surrender documents, they moved urgently to coordinate safe zones and ceasefire lines, deploying radio broadcasts in Japanese instructing troops across the homeland and occupied territories to lay down their arms, though in some regions, cut off from communication or influenced by commanders unwilling to accept defeat, isolated pockets of resistance persisted, reflecting the deep cultural and psychological commitment Japan had maintained throughout the war. Across the Pacific, ships of the U.S. Navy prepared to enter Japanese waters for the first time in history, guided by strict orders to maintain discipline and avoid confrontation, their decks lined with sailors observing the horizon for signs of hostility, while also sensing the monumental significance of their mission. They were not approaching Japan as invaders, but as representatives of the victorious Allied powers overseeing the transition from war to peace. On the ground in Japan, the situation was dire. Cities devastated by months of bombing, food supplies dangerously low, transportation networks fractured, and millions of civilians displaced. Yet despite the hardship, many citizens began cautiously preparing for the arrival of Allied forces, unsure whether they would be met with compassion or retribution, holding on to hope that surrender would prevent further suffering. And in Washington, President Truman addressed the nation with a voice heavy with both victory and solemnity, reminding Americans that although the war had ended, the responsibility of peace had only begun, for the world now faced the dual challenge of rebuilding shattered nations while preventing future conflicts in an era where the destructive potential of atomic weapons loomed over every political decision. As the USS Missouri anchored in Tokyo Bay, its massive silhouette becoming a floating symbol of the new era, preparations for the formal surrender ceremony unfolded with meticulous care, because every detail, from the placement of documents to the positioning of dignitaries, would be recorded as part of the historical moment marking the end of World War II. Japanese representatives, wearing formal civilian attire rather than military uniforms, boarded the ship under the watchful gaze of thousands of Allied personnel, their expressions solemn but resolute as they walked across the deck toward the table where the surrender documents awaited. The ceremony itself lasted only minutes, yet it carried the weight of millions of lives, millions of sacrifices, and years of global conflict, and when the final signature was placed upon the parchment, a quiet fell across the deck, a silence so profound that even the wind seemed to pause, as if acknowledging that history had shifted not through a decisive battle or dramatic conquest, but through a recognition that war had reached a point where humanity could no longer afford its cost. Across the world, celebrations erupted. Crowds filled streets in New York, London, Paris, Manila, and Sydney, cheering, crying, embracing, relieved that the long night of global warfare had finally ended, while in Japan, the mood was far more somber, marked by reflection and uncertainty as citizens faced an unfamiliar future shaped by occupation, reconstruction, and the necessity of redefining national identity. Yet beneath these public reactions, a deeper transformation had begun, one that would shape military strategy, international diplomacy, and global ethics for generations to come, because Operation Downfall, once planned as the most massive invasion in history, had been rendered obsolete not by battlefield outcomes but by the reality of atomic capability, forcing nations to confront the possibility that future wars, if fought with such weapons, could end not in surrender but in annihilation. This realization ignited a new urgency among world leaders who understood that victory in World War II had come at the cost of stepping into an age where human civilization's survival depended on restraint, cooperation, and the ability to prevent conflicts rather than escalate them. In the months that followed, Allied forces occupied Japan with a discipline that surprised many civilians, emphasizing stability, humanitarian aid, and the rebuilding of essential services, while simultaneously dismantling Japan's wartime structures and guiding the nation toward democratic reforms that would reshape its political and social landscape. The presence of American forces in Tokyo, Osaka, and other major cities created scenes that would have been unimaginable just months earlier. Soldiers handing out food to children, engineers repairing bridges, medics treating civilians, reflecting a strategic shift from conqueror to guardian, one intended not to humiliate Japan but to prevent the conditions that might give rise to future militarism. Meanwhile, the global scientific community reflected deeply on its role in the creation of the atomic age, with many researchers who had contributed to the Manhattan Project now advocating for international oversight, transparency, and the prevention of nuclear proliferation, warning that the weapon they had created could one day threaten the very existence of humanity if left unchecked. This tension, between progress and peril, victory and vulnerability, defined the early post-war world, shaping the emerging geopolitical landscape and laying the foundations for the alliances, rivalries, and doctrines that would dominate the second half of the 20th century. By the end of 1945, Japan had begun the long process of rebuilding not only its infrastructure but its identity, guided by a constitution that renounced war and established new principles of governance, marking a dramatic transformation driven by both necessity and the influence of Allied occupation forces. Factories once dedicated to producing instruments of war now manufactured tools, appliances, and consumer goods that would fuel Japan's post-war economic rise, while citizens embraced new freedoms and opportunities even as they mourned the past they had lost. And as the world stepped cautiously into the new era, one truth became increasingly clear. Operation Downfall had been avoided not because the Allies lacked courage or capability, but because humanity had reached a crossroads where the traditional logic of warfare no longer applied, replaced by a recognition that survival depended on restraint, diplomacy, and the ability to prevent future conflicts from escalating into catastrophes beyond imagination. Thus, the legacy of the war's final chapter extended far beyond the surrender ceremony aboard the USS Missouri, echoing through the halls of governments, the debates of scientists, and the consciousness of nations as they grappled with the reality that the peace they had achieved was fragile, precious, and essential to protect in a world forever changed by the shadow of atomic fire. And yet even as the world stepped hesitantly into the fragile peace that followed Japan's surrender, the consequences of the war's final decisions began to ripple outward in ways no general, scientist, or politician could fully control, shaping a new era built not on armies maneuvering across continents, but on ideologies, technologies, and uneasy alliances that would define the second half of the 20th century. For while nations celebrated the end of global conflict, leaders in Washington, Moscow, London, and other capitals quickly realized that the atomic bomb had not simply ended a war. It had redrawn the boundaries of power, trust, and fear, creating a geopolitical landscape where victory and vulnerability existed side by side. As American occupation forces settled into Japan, their presence became the foundation of a vast reconstruction effort that aimed not merely to stabilize the nation but to transform it, replacing the wartime hierarchy with democratic institutions, introducing economic reforms, and reshaping education and political culture in ways that would guide Japan toward a peaceful future. And yet beneath these sweeping changes lay a quieter, more personal transformation as Japanese citizens, emerging from years of hardship, began rebuilding their lives one step at a time, reopening shops, repairing homes, and attempting to reconnect families separated by bombing campaigns, evacuations, and military service. Meanwhile, the American servicemen stationed across the country found themselves engaged in missions far different from combat, distributing food, restoring utilities, providing medical care, and even teaching classes to children, creating daily interactions that softened the fear many Japanese had expected when imagining occupation forces arriving as conquerors rather than partners in rebuilding. Photographs from the period capture these moments vividly. American soldiers handing out chocolate to curious children, engineers repairing streetcars, sailors helping farmers rebuild damaged fields, scenes that only months earlier would have been unthinkable. But beyond the humanitarian efforts and political reforms lay a deeper strategic calculation shaping America's post-war approach. The United States recognized that Japan, once its most formidable enemy in the Pacific, could become a crucial ally in the emerging global landscape, a landscape increasingly defined by ideological rivalry with the Soviet Union, whose own wartime mobilization had transformed it into a military and political giant capable of challenging Western influence across Europe and Asia. Even as the last American battleships remained anchored in Japanese waters, analysts in Washington and London were examining Soviet movements across Eastern Europe, where new governments supported by Moscow were taking shape, raising concerns among Allied planners that the end of World War II might be followed not by sustained peace, but by a prolonged struggle of ideologies, democracy, communism, and the uncertain future of nations trying to redefine themselves in the rubble left behind by global conflict. Japan, devastated but strategically located, suddenly became a focal point in this widening geopolitical tension, and American policymakers pushed to accelerate reforms that would stabilize the country quickly, ensuring it would not fall into economic chaos or political turmoil that might invite external influence. As these diplomatic currents swirled, the Japanese people continued adapting to daily realities. Rationing remained strict, transportation systems were fragile, black markets thrived, and families searched for missing relatives across a disrupted archipelago. Yet amidst all this, small signs of renewal began to appear: schools reopening, local festivals returning in modest form, farmers replanting fields, and newspapers printing messages of hope alongside discussions of the nation's uncertain future. Across the Pacific, the United States faced its own transition as millions of servicemen returned home to cities and towns eager to welcome them back. Yet these veterans carried with them not only memories of distant battles, but the realization that the world had changed profoundly during their absence. Industries shifted back to peacetime production, families reunited, and celebrations filled city streets. But beneath the joy lay questions about the responsibilities that came with America's new global influence and the moral weight of having introduced atomic weapons to human conflict. Public debates emerged, newspapers published editorials, scientists expressed deep concern about the future of nuclear technology, and policymakers grappled with how to balance national security with the need to prevent a future arms race that might threaten the survival of all nations. Meanwhile, the Soviet Union, having declared war on Japan in the final days of the conflict, expanded its presence in East Asia by occupying parts of Manchuria and Korea, actions that added urgency to American plans to stabilize Japan and support emerging democratic governments across Asia. Tensions between Washington and Moscow, though not yet openly hostile, began to deepen as each side interpreted the post-war order through competing lenses shaped by ideology, security, and visions for global leadership. Inside Japan, Emperor Hirohito's role transformed dramatically as he shifted from a divine figurehead to a constitutional monarch, addressing his people in public appearances unlike any before, speaking not in imperial proclamations but in humble appeals for unity, perseverance, and commitment to peace, messages that resonated deeply with a populace searching for direction in the aftermath of devastation. Scholars, teachers, and community leaders debated how the nation should educate its youth, reshape its industries, and participate in the global community, while artists, writers, and filmmakers began processing the emotional and cultural impact of the war, producing works that documented loss, resilience, and the complexities of national identity during a period of rapid transformation. American officials overseeing the occupation witnessed these changes with a mixture of admiration and caution, aware that rebuilding Japan required sensitivity to cultural traditions as well as firmness on political reforms, and thus the occupation evolved into one of the most ambitious and nuanced reconstruction efforts in modern history. As new laws were drafted and implemented, political parties formed, labor unions organized, and women gained voting rights for the first time, marking a profound shift in Japanese society that would later fuel a period of unprecedented economic growth and cultural revitalization. And yet, despite these hopeful signs, the shadow of the war's end continued to loom over international relations. Nations around the world watched as the United States and the Soviet Union, once allies against fascism, began dividing the post-war world into spheres of influence, setting the stage for diplomatic standoffs, military alliances, and ideological rivalries that would eventually crystallize into the Cold War. As atomic scientists urged the creation of international frameworks to control nuclear weapons, political leaders deliberated strategies for deterrence, defense, and diplomacy in a world where conflict could no longer be measured solely in troop numbers or artillery, but in the catastrophic potential of nuclear exchange. And through it all, Japan remained at the center of a historic transformation, rebuilt from ashes, restructured from its foundations, and reshaped into a nation whose future would stand as both a reminder of the past and a symbol of global recovery. For the operation that had never been launched, Operation Downfall, had cast a long shadow across military planning, diplomacy, and ethics, and its cancellation in favor of atomic deployment ensured that the lessons of the Pacific War would be debated for decades to come, influencing not only how wars were fought but how peace was defined. As winter approached in late 1945 and early 1946, the streets of Tokyo, Osaka, and Hiroshima filled with signs of rebuilding. Bricks stacked neatly beside construction sites, children walking to newly reopened schools, families warming themselves beside makeshift stoves, each scene quietly marking the beginning of a new chapter in which Japan, once a formidable empire built on military expansion, embarked on a journey toward peace, innovation, and global cooperation that would transform its place in the world for generations to come. And as Japan stepped cautiously into the first months of peace, a quiet transformation unfolded across the Pacific. Subtle at first, barely visible beneath the rubble of war, yet destined to reshape not only Japan's future but the balance of global power for decades. For while the world's attention remained fixed on reconstruction, diplomacy, and the unprecedented task of rebuilding a nation devastated by conflict, the deeper significance of the war's end began to emerge in conversations among generals, diplomats, scientists, and ordinary people searching for meaning in the war's final, staggering chapter. In Washington, policymakers pored over intelligence reports detailing the extent of Japan's preparations for resistance during Operation Downfall, the tunnels, the coastal fortifications, the mobilized civilians, and realized with growing clarity that the cancellation of the invasion had spared not only millions of Allied soldiers, but millions of Japanese civilians whose lives would have been forever altered by a prolonged final battle. Meanwhile, in Tokyo, a similar realization took shape as Japanese officers studied their own wartime plans, understanding that even their most determined defenses would have been overwhelmed beneath the sheer scale of the Allied assault, a truth that fueled a quiet gratitude behind the official sorrow of surrender. Across Japan, citizens began participating in new political processes, forming community groups, engaging in debates, learning about democratic governance, and voting in local elections that represented a dramatic shift from the nation's pre-war political structure. Women, granted voting rights for the first time, stood in long lines outside polling stations, their presence symbolizing the broader social transformation taking root across the country. Schools reopened with revised curricula emphasizing peace, scientific progress, and civic responsibility, replacing militaristic lessons that had shaped the previous generation, while newspapers published editorials discussing how Japan might redefine itself not through conquest but through innovation, diplomacy, and economic growth. American occupation authorities, recognizing the importance of stability, focused on restoring essential infrastructure and stimulating economic activity, repairing bridges, reopening factories, and providing resources for agriculture to prevent famine. These actions helped stabilize the nation and fostered a cautious sense of optimism among the Japanese people, who began to see a path forward even amid the hardships of post-war recovery. In the countryside, farmers prepared their fields for planting seasons that promised new harvests after years of shortages, while in cities, shopkeepers reopened markets and craftsmen returned to their trades, contributing to a gradual resurgence of daily life. Children, many of whom had known nothing but wartime scarcity, discovered new opportunities for education, play, and community events that signaled a return to normalcy. At the same time, international observers noted the remarkable discipline and cooperation displayed by both Japanese citizens and American occupation forces, whose interactions, once expected to be tense, often evolved into respectful relationships built on mutual understanding. Photographs captured scenes of American soldiers assisting Japanese elders with supplies, helping rebuild damaged homes, and sharing small acts of kindness that softened the memory of wartime hostility. Across the world, leaders grappled with the deeper implications of the war's end. The creation of the United Nations symbolized a global desire to prevent future conflicts through dialogue rather than force, yet beneath these aspirations lay the sobering reality that atomic technology had forever changed the stakes of international relations. The United States, now the sole possessor of atomic weapons, faced the dual responsibility of ensuring national security, while also preventing the unchecked spread of nuclear technology, prompting debates among scientists and diplomats about how humanity could preserve peace in an era where a single weapon carried the power to reshape continents. The Soviet Union, aware of the strategic imbalance created by America's new capabilities, accelerated its own scientific efforts, setting in motion a competitive struggle that would come to define the geopolitical landscape of the Cold War. And in Europe, nations recovering from occupation and destruction faced the daunting task of rebuilding governments, economies, and cultural institutions, drawing lessons from the devastating consequences of fascism and militarism in hopes of creating more stable, collaborative futures. Meanwhile, in Japan, Emperor Hirohito's role as a national figurehead shifted into one of symbolic leadership, representing unity and encouraging the country to embrace peace and coexistence with former adversaries. For many Japanese citizens, this new direction offered a sense of clarity during an otherwise uncertain period, and the emperor's public appearances drew crowds seeking reassurance as they rebuilt their lives amid the ruins. Over time, the American-led occupation introduced reforms aimed at decentralizing economic power, expanding civil rights, and promoting industrial diversification, initiatives that would lay the foundation for Japan's remarkable post-war economic growth, transforming the nation from a defeated empire into one of the world's most advanced economies. Factories that once produced aircraft and military equipment now shifted toward manufacturing automobiles, electronics, and consumer goods, industries that would eventually place Japan at the forefront of global technology and trade. This transformation, however, did not occur overnight. It required years of planning, cooperation, and adaptation as Japan navigated the delicate balance between preserving cultural identity and embracing foreign ideas that promised a more prosperous future. As the 1940s drew to a close, the global community reflected on the lessons of the war with a mixture of hope and sorrow. Millions had perished, cities had been reduced to ashes, and nations had been reshaped by the tides of conflict. Yet amid the devastation emerged a renewed commitment to international cooperation and peace. For many historians, Operation Downfall, though never executed, remained a defining turning point in the war's conclusion, representing the catastrophic level of destruction that was avoided through diplomacy and the decisive use of atomic weapons. Yet for others, the cancellation of the invasion raised profound ethical questions about warfare, technology, and the cost of peace in the atomic age. These debates continued for decades, shaping academic discussions, political decisions, and cultural works that sought to understand the war's final moments in all their complexity. And through it all, the people of Japan rebuilt not simply their cities or industries but their identity, forging a path that transformed the nation from a militaristic empire into a democratic, economically vibrant society whose contributions to global culture, technology, and diplomacy would become some of the most influential of the 20th century. Children who had once crouched in air raid shelters grew up to become engineers, artists, scholars, and leaders of a nation committed to peace. Soldiers who returned home to ruined neighborhoods worked alongside former adversaries to restore the infrastructure that would support future generations, and families who had experienced profound loss found strength in community as they shaped a new vision of Japan's role in the world. By the early 1950s, as the post-war occupation drew to a close and Japan regained sovereignty, the nation stood transformed, not through conquest or military power but through resilience, cooperation, and a determination to build a future free from the shadows of war. In the decades that followed, Japan's rapid economic rise astonished the world, demonstrating how a nation devastated by conflict could, through unity and innovation, become a global leader, and its post-war constitution, renouncing war as a means of settling international disputes, became a symbol of its commitment to peace. Yet the memory of what nearly occurred, the colossal invasion that never took place, the suffering that was spared, and the cities that were rebuilt instead of destroyed, remained embedded in the country's collective consciousness. And as historians, politicians, and citizens reflected on the final chapter of the war, one truth echoed across borders and generations. Operation Downfall ended not with a battle, but with a decision that changed not only the war's ending but humanity's future, reminding the world that the most powerful victories are often those that prevent destruction rather than achieve it. Thus, the hidden operation that never launched, the plan that was set aside in favor of an unprecedented new weapon, became one of the most consequential turning points in modern history, shaping the dawn of a world where the fate of nations would no longer be decided solely by armies on the battlefield, but by the choices leaders made in the face of unimaginable power. If you found this story compelling, please take a moment to like this video. It helps us share more forgotten stories from the Second World War. Subscribe to stay connected with these untold histories. Each one matters. Each one deserves to be remembered, and we would love to hear from you. Leave a comment below telling us where you are watching from. Our community spans from Texas to Tasmania, from veterans to history enthusiasts. You are part of something special here. Thank you for watching, and thank you for keeping these stories alive.